He was 18 years old, homeless, and running on the fumes of a half-remembered promise. What he would find at the end of that lonely road wasn't just a dilapidated farmhouse, but a secret that had been buried for a decade, waiting for him. And what he chose to do with it would redefine the meaning of home, family, and survival. If you've ever felt like you were completely on your own, like the world had forgotten you, then I think you'll understand my story. Stick around and maybe share a piece of your own in the comments below, because stories like these are how we remind each other we're not alone. The bus groaned to a halt at a crossroads marked only by a leaning stop sign and a field of withered corn stalks shivering in the wind. This was it, the end of the line. "This is as far as I go, kid," the driver said, his voice a gravelly echo in the otherwise empty bus. He didn't look at me, just stared out the windshield at the gray, indifferent sky. I mumbled a thank you, the words feeling foreign and brittle in my mouth. I grabbed my backpack from the seat beside me. It wasn't heavy. 2 changes of clothes, a half-eaten bag of pretzels, a water bottle, and the worn photograph of a woman I barely remembered. Everything I owned in the world. The hydraulic hiss of the doors opening was the sound of my life being cleaved in two. The life before this moment, and whatever was supposed to come after. I stepped down onto the cracked asphalt shoulder, and the doors sighed shut behind me. The bus pulled away, its red tail lights shrinking into the twilight until they were just angry pinpricks, and then nothing. I was alone. The silence that descended was absolute. It wasn't the quiet of a library or a late-night city street. It was a deep, bottomless quiet that pressed in on me, amplifying the frantic beat of my own heart. For 2 years, I'd lived in a group home, a place that ran on the relentless noise of schedules and regulations, of shouted conversations, and the constant low hum of institutional life. Before that, a string of foster homes, each with its own chaotic soundtrack. Silence was a language I no longer spoke. Today was my 18th birthday, the day I aged out. They'd given me a small envelope with my final allowance, a list of resources I couldn't afford, and a firm handshake from a man whose name I'd already forgotten. "Good luck, Leo," he'd said, with the same practiced enthusiasm he probably used on all the kids they launched into the world like unguided rockets. I'd walked out of that building, the only home I'd known for the past 24 months, and kept walking until I reached the bus station. I'd spent almost all my money on a one-way ticket to a place that didn't even have a name on the map. It was just a smudge, a ghost of a memory from a life I lived before the system claimed me. My grandmother's farm. The social workers had told me she was gone, that the property was condemned, lost to the banks or the county. They told me there was nothing there for me. "Don't go back there, Leo," my last caseworker, Ms. Albright, had warned. "It's not safe. There are legal issues. You need to look forward, not back." But where was forward? A homeless shelter in a city that had already chewed me up and spit me out. A low-wage job that would barely cover a room in a place I didn't want to be. No, the past was all I had. The farm was a long shot, a desperate prayer whispered into the void, but it was mine. Or it had been. The road stretched before me, a ribbon of crumbling gray pavement disappearing into the woods. The directions were burned into my memory. A story my grandmother used to tell me as a child. A game to help me find my way home if I ever got lost. 3 miles down Old Creek Road, her voice echoed in my head, a phantom of comfort. Past the big weeping willow that looks like a sad old woman. Then a left at the split-rail fence with the missing top rail. You can't miss it, my little lion. I adjusted the straps on my backpack and started walking. The air was cold, carrying the damp, earthy smell of decay and the coming winter. The trees lining the road were skeletal, their bare branches clawing at the bruised purple sky. Every gust of wind sounded like a whisper, and every shadow seemed to shift and writhe in my peripheral vision. I was a city kid, born and bred in the concrete maze. This kind of raw, untamed nature felt alien, hostile. The group home, for all its faults, had walls. It had locks. Out here, there was nothing between me and the vast, dark emptiness of the world. After what felt like an eternity, I saw it. The weeping willow, its long, trailing branches swaying mournfully in the breeze, just as she'd described. My heart gave a painful lurch. It was real. A piece of the story was real. My pace quickened, a new, fragile hope fluttering in my chest. And then the fence, old, gray, and weathered, with the top rail splintered and missing on the corner post. I made the left turn onto a gravel driveway so overgrown with weeds that it was barely a path. It snaked through a dense thicket of trees for another 100 yards before opening into a clearing. And there it was. The house was a silhouette against the last vestiges of daylight, a dark, hulking shape that seemed more like a wound on the landscape than a home. The roof sagged in the middle, the porch tilted at a drunken angle, and most of the windows were dark, vacant eyes, some of them shattered. A barn to the left of the house had fared even worse. A large section of its roof had caved in, leaving a gaping maw open to the elements. Miss Albright was right. It was a ruin. The hope that had carried me all this way evaporated, replaced by the familiar, cold weight of despair. I had come all this way for nothing. This wasn't a home. It was a grave. I sank to my knees in the damp gravel, the sharp stones digging into my jeans. The long journey, the last of my money, the desperate gamble, it had all led to this. A final, crushing, dead end. The silence pressed in again, but this time it felt different. It wasn't just empty, it was watchful. I had the distinct, prickling sensation of being observed. I scanned the tree line, the dark windows of the house, the cavernous opening of the barn. Nothing. And then I heard it. A low growl, coming from the direction of the tilting porch. My blood ran cold. I slowly got to my feet, my mind racing. A stray dog? A coyote? Worse? Two shapes detached themselves from the shadows under the porch. They were large dogs, their coats matted and dark. One was a German Shepherd mix, all sharp angles and alert ears. The other was a shaggier, bulkier creature, something like a Pyrenees, but filthy with mud and grime. They stood side by side, a united front, their eyes fixed on me. The growling intensified, a deep, rumbling threat that vibrated through the ground. This was it. I had survived the system, survived the city, only to be torn apart by a pair of feral dogs in the middle of nowhere. It was a grim, pathetic end to a grim, pathetic story. I held up my hands, a useless gesture of surrender. "Easy," I whispered, my voice trembling. "I'm not going to hurt you." They didn't move, didn't blink. They just watched me, their bodies tensed, ready to spring. I took a slow step back. The growling got louder. I was trapped. The sun had completely set now, and the world was bathed in the thin, silvery light of a rising moon. The dogs were no longer just shapes. They were guardians. And it was becoming terrifyingly clear that they weren't guarding the property from me. They were guarding it for me. The shepherd took a step forward, then another, its head low. But it didn't bark, didn't charge. It stopped about 10 feet away and whined, a high, questioning sound. It nudged its head in the direction of a smaller, dilapidated structure I hadn't noticed before, tucked away behind a stand of overgrown lilac bushes. A shed. The other dog, the big, shaggy one, let out a soft woof and also looked toward the shed. It was the strangest thing I'd ever seen. They weren't threatening me anymore. They were trying to tell me something. They were leading me somewhere. My fear, which had been a solid block of ice in my stomach, began to fracture, making way for a cautious, bewildered curiosity. Against every rational instinct, I took a tentative step, not away from them, but toward them. Toward the house. Toward the shed they seemed so intent on showing me. The shepherd backed up, maintaining the distance, and let out another encouraging whine. My journey wasn't over. It was just beginning. The cold was starting to seep into my bones, a deep, invasive chill that my thin jacket couldn't fight. The dogs kept their distance, two silent escorts guiding me across the yard. The ground was uneven, a treacherous landscape of tangled roots and hidden holes, but their presence was strangely calming. They moved with a familiarity that spoke of years spent on this land. They belonged here. I didn't. I followed them past the groaning porch of the main house, around the side, and through the skeletal remains of what must have once been a garden. The lilac bushes were a thorny wall, but the dogs knew a path through them, a narrow trail beaten down by the passage of their own bodies. On the other side stood the shed. It was small, no bigger than a single-car garage, and in even worse shape than the house. Its wood was silvered and splintered with age. The roof was a patchwork of moss and rust, and the single door hung crookedly on one hinge. A heavy, rusted padlock held it shut. This was what they wanted me to see. The shepherd sat on its haunches and looked from the lock to me and back again, letting out a soft huff of air. The bigger dog paced restlessly, a low whine rumbling in its chest. There was an urgency to their behavior that I couldn't ignore. Okay, I see it," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "It's locked. What do you want me to do?" The shepherd barked once, a sharp, commanding sound that echoed in the night. It was an answer. Open it. My mind was a whirlwind of confusion. How? Why? Was there something inside? Food? Shelter? It seemed unlikely. The shed looked like it would collapse if a strong wind blew. I ran my hand over the padlock. It was an old, heavy-duty model, and the rust was so thick it seemed to have fused the metal together. There was no way I could force it. I needed a tool, something to break it. I looked around the yard, my eyes scanning the debris-strewn ground. A fallen branch, too flimsy. A loose rock, too small. My gaze fell on the dilapidated barn. It was a shadow full of other shadows, a place my fear-addled brain screamed not to enter. But it was also my only hope. "I'll be right back," I told the dogs, feeling ridiculous for talking to them, but needing to fill the silence. They watched me, unmoving, as I picked my way carefully toward the barn's gaping entrance. The air inside was thick with the smell of hay, dust, and damp earth. Moonlight filtered through the holes in the roof, illuminating floating dust motes and casting long, eerie shadows. Piles of rotting hay were scattered across the floor, and old, rusted farm equipment lay abandoned like the bones of prehistoric beasts. I stepped carefully, my sneakers crunching on debris. I was looking for a crowbar, a hammer, anything with some leverage. In a far corner, half buried under a collapsed section of the loft, I saw it. A tire iron, left beside the skeletal remains of a rusted-out tractor. It was heavy in my hand, solid and real, a tool, a key. When I emerged from the barn, the dogs were exactly where I had left them, a silent, patient vigil. I walked back to the shed, the tire iron feeling like a weapon, a purpose. I wedged the flattened end of the iron into the shackle of the padlock. I put my shoulder into it and pushed. The metal groaned in protest, a high-pitched screech that set my teeth on edge. The rust fought back, holding on with the stubborn grip of time itself. I repositioned my feet, took a deep breath, and threw all of my weight into it. There was a loud crack, like a gunshot in the stillness, and the shackle snapped. The lock fell to the ground with a dull thud. For a moment I just stood there, breathing heavily, my heart hammering against my ribs. The dogs pressed closer now, their initial caution gone, replaced by an almost frantic anticipation. I reached for the door. The wood was cold and rough under my fingertips. I pulled. It resisted, swollen in its frame, but then, with a final shuddering groan, it swung inward, opening into a square of perfect blackness. A wave of musty air washed over me, the scent of old wood, dry soil, and something else, something clean and metallic, like old coins. It was a smell of things carefully stored, of things waiting. I fumbled in my pocket for my phone, my thumb swiping clumsily to turn on a flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing the shed's interior. It wasn't full of junk, as I had expected. It was surprisingly neat. Shelves lined one wall, holding neatly labeled jars of what looked like preserved vegetables and fruits, now desiccated and shrunken. Garden tools hung in orderly rows on another wall. A spade, a hoe, a rake, their metal heads coated in a thin layer of protective grease. And in the center of the dirt floor there was a single object, a large olive-drab metal footlocker. It was an old army surplus box, the kind you see in war movies. It looked completely out of place in this rustic, decaying shed. The dogs padded in past me, their claws clicking softly on the hard-packed earth. They went straight to the footlocker. The shepherd nudged it with its nose, then looked back at me, its tail giving a single, hopeful thump against the ground. This was it. This was the thing they had brought me to. I knelt beside the box. There were 2 latches on the front, but they weren't locked. My fingers trembled as I reached for them. They were stiff, but they flipped open with a satisfying clank. I paused, my hand hovering over the lid. What could be in here? What secret was so important that these 2 animals had seemingly been left to guard it? My entire life, I had been told there was nothing for me here. No family, no home, no inheritance. Just a sad story and a piece of land the state would eventually seize. But these dogs, this shed, this box, they told a different story. They spoke of intention, of purpose. Someone had packed this box. Someone had locked this shed. Someone had wanted it to be found. I took a breath to steady myself, the cold air stinging my lungs. I was afraid. I was afraid of what I would find, but I was more afraid of what would happen if I didn't look. The alternative was to walk away, back to the road, back to a life of shelters and uncertainty, back to being no one. This box, whatever it held, was a chance to be someone. It was a connection to a past I'd been denied, a link to the grandmother whose face I only knew from a faded photograph. I lifted the lid. The hinges creaked, the sound deafeningly loud in the small space. The beam of my phone's flashlight fell inside, and my breath caught in my throat. It wasn't filled with junk or old clothes. It was packed with meticulously organized bundles of cash, wrapped in thick rubber bands. Stacks and stacks of it. more money than I had ever seen in my life. And on top of the money, nestled in the center, was a large, sealed manila envelope. My name was written on it in a familiar, elegant cursive I recognized instantly from the handful of birthday cards I'd received as a small child. For Leo. This was from her, my grandmother. She had left this for me. The dogs sat pressed against my legs, their warmth a comfort against the encroaching cold. They whined softly, as if they understood the gravity of the moment, as if their long watch was finally over. I reached into the box, my hand shaking so much I could barely grasp the envelope. The paper was thick and heavy, a tangible piece of my past. It felt like I was holding a ghost. The world outside the shed seemed to fall away. There was only the narrow beam of my phone's light, the musty air, the two warm bodies of the dogs pressed against me, and the heavy weight of the envelope in my hands. My name, Leo, was written with a deliberate, loving stroke. It wasn't the sterile, typewritten label of the system. It was a name given, a name known. I ran my thumb over the seal on the back. It was wax, a deep burgundy color, stamped with the impression of a single oak leaf. It was a small, anachronistic detail that spoke of care and intention. Everything about this felt like a ceremony. My fingers found the edge of the flap, and I carefully, painstakingly, broke the seal. The sound was a soft crackle, the severing of a tie to the past decade of my life, a decade of ignorance and loneliness. Inside there were several thick pages, folded together, covered in that same elegant script. I unfolded them, the paper crisp and cool to the touch. The flashlight beam trembled as I held it over the first page. "My dearest Leo," the letter began. "If you are reading this, then it means two things. First, it means you have come home. And second, it means I am gone. I am so sorry, my little lion. I am sorry for all the years we have lost, and for the silence you must have mistaken for abandonment." I had to stop and take a breath. The words were a physical blow, knocking the wind out of me. A knot of grief and anger that I had carried for years, a hard, dense stone in my chest, began to crumble. She hadn't abandoned me. She knew I would come back. "There is so much I need to explain," the letter continued, "and so little time to write it. I need you to listen, Leo. I need you to understand that every choice I made, every painful decision, was to protect you. It was all for you." The neat cursive of her handwriting blurred as my eyes filled with tears. I wiped them away angrily with the back of my hand and forced myself to keep reading. "Our family has owned this land for over 100 years. It is part of us, in our blood and in our bones. But the world outside our fence has sharp teeth. Your grandfather, a good but trusting man, made a bad deal a long time ago with a man named Marcus Thorne. It was a loan to save the farm during a bad season, a handshake deal that turned into a nightmare. Thorne wasn't a banker, Leo. He was a predator. The debt grew, the interest piled up, and when your grandfather passed, that debt fell to me. Thorne wanted this land. He didn't care about the money. He wanted the property for a development deal he was planning. My mind reeled. A debt. A man named Thorne. This was the secret history I was never told, the reason my life had been shattered. I fought him for years in court, but the system favors men like him. He had money, connections. I had a small farm and a grandson to raise. When you were 7, he started making threats. Not legal threats anymore, but personal ones. He knew you were my weakness. He said that if I didn't sign the land over to him, he would make sure something happened. An accident. He would make sure I lost you one way or another. I looked into his eyes, Leo, and I knew he meant it. He was a man with no soul. A cold dread washed over me, colder than the night air. This wasn't about a bank foreclosure. This was something far more dangerous. So I made a choice, the hardest choice of my life. I couldn't give him the land, it was your birthright. But I couldn't protect you here anymore. I found a way to hide you in plain sight. I made it look like I was destitute, that I had abandoned the farm and given you up to the state. I created a paper trail of foreclosure notices and debt collections, all leading to a shell company that Thorne would think was the bank. It cost me everything I had, but it worked. He believed the farm was lost in legal limbo, tied up by the county for back taxes. He moved on, thinking he would just wait for it to go to public auction. He didn't know that I had already paid the taxes off for the next 20 years through an anonymous trust. He didn't know the farm was safe. I read that paragraph again, and then a third time, trying to comprehend the sheer complexity of her plan. She had built a fortress of lies to protect me, a maze of legal fiction. She had made herself a villain in my story to save my life. The money in this box is everything I managed to save over the years, working odd jobs in the next town over, living as quietly as a mouse. It's not a fortune, but it should be enough to get you started, to fix the roof, to buy some food. Use it wisely. The deed to the farm is in a safe deposit box at the county bank. The key is taped to the bottom of this footlocker. The farm is yours, Leo, truly yours. No one can take it from you now. By the time you read this, the statute of limitations on Thorne's claim will have expired. You are 18. You are the legal owner. You are free. I lowered the letter, my hand shaking uncontrollably. I reached under the footlocker, and my fingers brushed against a small, cold piece of metal held by a strip of duct tape. A key. It was all real. She had planned for everything. The dogs, who had been silent all this time, seemed to sense the shift in me. The big one rested its heavy head on my knee, its dark eyes full of a soft, knowing intelligence. I realized they weren't just strays who had wandered onto the property. They were hers. She must have left them here, or they had found their way back after she was gone. They weren't just guards, they were a welcoming party. There is one more thing you must know, the final page read. I am sick, Leo. The doctors gave me a year, maybe 2, when I wrote this. I didn't have much time left to watch over you from a distance. My greatest regret is that I will not be there on the porch to welcome you home. But I will be here. I am in the roots of the old oak tree, in the stone of the foundation, in the wind that whispers through the pines. This land is our family's heart, and now it is in your care. Be strong, my little lion. Be brave, but most of all, be happy. You deserve to be happy. All my love, forever, your Grandma Rose. I couldn't hold it back anymore. The tears came, hot and silent, trailing down my face and dripping onto the brittle paper. I cried for the little boy who thought he'd been abandoned. I cried for the woman who had sacrificed everything, who had died alone to give me a future. I cried for the years stolen from us by a man I'd never met. I sat there in the dark, cold shed for a long time, the letter clutched in my hand, the dogs leaning against me, and I wept until I had no tears left. When the grief subsided, it left behind something new, a feeling I hadn't had in a long, long time. It wasn't happiness, not yet. It was something harder, stronger. It was resolve. This wasn't just a piece of land anymore. It wasn't just a broken-down house. It was a legacy. It was a promise. It was the final, defiant act of a woman who had loved me more than I had ever known, and I would not let her down. This was my home now, and I would fight for it. I want to pause here for a second, because maybe this is hitting you in a real way. Have you ever discovered a truth about your past that changed everything you thought you knew? Maybe it was a family secret, or a story someone told you that turned out to be a lie meant to protect you. It's a moment that can break you, or it can remake you. If you've ever been through something like that, I want you to know this community here is a place where those stories are understood. Let me know in the comments if this is resonating. Your story matters. And if you're finding some value in this, consider subscribing. We're building something more than just a channel here. Now, let's get back to what I found next. The first light of dawn was filtering through the cracks in the shed walls, casting dusty gray stripes across the dirt floor. The world was slowly turning from black and white to color. I had spent the entire night in that shed, the letter clutched in my hand, the dogs sleeping at my feet. My body ached with cold and exhaustion, but my mind was clearer than it had been in years. The grief was still there, a heavy ache in my chest, but it was now intertwined with a fierce, protective anger and a profound sense of purpose. I had a name for my enemy, Marcus Thorne. I had a mission, to reclaim my home, and I had a guide, the final words of my grandmother. I folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the manila envelope, tucking it securely into the inner pocket of my jacket. I felt under the footlocker again, peeling the duct tape off and freeing the small, cold key. It felt impossibly heavy, a key to a life I was never meant to have. The money was the next problem. It was a staggering amount to someone who was used to counting change for the bus. I didn't even try to count it all. I just knew it was both a blessing and a burden. I couldn't leave it here. I couldn't carry it all. I bundled up a few stacks of the smaller bills, enough to last me a while, and stuffed them into my backpack. The rest I left in the footlocker, closing the lid and latching it shut. It felt safer here, in this hidden sanctuary, than anywhere else. As I stood up, my stiff limbs protesting, the dogs stirred. They stretched, shook themselves off, and looked up at me expectantly. Their names. I didn't know their names. Looking at the stoic, intelligent shepherd, the name Ranger came to mind. He seemed like a scout, a guardian. The big, shaggy one, with his calm and comforting presence, felt like a bear. Ranger? Bear? I tried the names out loud. The shepherd's ears perked up, and Bear's tail gave a lazy thump, thump, thump against the ground. They were her dogs, and now they were mine. I stepped out of the shed into the pale morning light. The farm looked different now. It was no longer a symbol of decay and hopelessness. It was a challenge. The sagging roof, the broken windows, the overgrown fields, they were not signs of failure, but a list of tasks, a project, a home waiting to be healed. My first priority was the house itself. I needed shelter, a place to sleep that wasn't a dirt floor. The front door was locked, the wood swollen tight in its frame. A broken window on the ground floor offered an entry point. I carefully cleared away the jagged shards of glass and hoisted myself through, landing with a soft thud on a dusty wooden floor. I was in what must have been the living room. The furniture was covered in white sheets, ghostly shapes in the dim light. A thick layer of dust coated every surface, dancing in the sunbeams that pierced through the grimy windows. It was like a time capsule. Nothing had been packed up or sold off. It had just been left. I walked through the downstairs rooms, my footsteps echoing in the silence. In the kitchen, a calendar on the wall was still turned to August, 10 years ago. A child's drawing, my drawing, of a lopsided house with a smiling sun was stuck to the refrigerator with a magnet. A lump formed in my throat. This wasn't just a house. It was a museum of my own lost childhood. I found the stairs and climbed them, the wood groaning in protest under my weight. There were 2 bedrooms upstairs. One was clearly hers, with a large, unmade bed and a stack of books on the nightstand. The other was mine. A small bed with a faded superhero bedspread, a wooden chest overflowing with old toys, a row of children's books on a shelf. I ran my hand over the dusty cover of a book I vaguely remembered, a story about a brave little tugboat. It was all too much. I had to get out, had to breathe. I went back outside, the dogs trailing me like shadows. My immediate needs were practical: water, food, warmth. I found the well pump in the backyard. After several minutes of frantic, rusty cranking, water began to gush out, first brown and sludgy, then clearing to a clean, cold stream. I drank deeply, the icy water a shock to my system. I splashed it on my face, washing away the grime and the tears. Food was next. The town, according to the old map in my head, was about 5 miles away. It was a long walk, but I had no choice. I put my backpack on, the weight of the money a strange and heavy secret. "You 2 stay here," I told the dogs, pointing a finger at the porch. "Guard the house." They seemed to understand, settling down on the top step as I started my trek down the long gravel driveway. The walk to town was a journey through a world I didn't belong to. Pickup trucks rumbled past, their drivers giving me curious, wary glances. I was an outsider, a ghost from the forgotten farm on Old Creek Road. The town was small, a single main street with a handful of storefronts, a grocery store, a hardware store, a diner, and a small brick building with a sign that read, "County Bank." My first stop was the grocery store. I bought the basics: bread, peanut butter, canned soup, coffee. I also bought 2 huge bags of dog food. The cashier, a woman with tired eyes and a kind smile, looked at the dog food. "Got a couple of hungry friends, do you?" she asked. "Something like that," I replied, my voice hoarse from disuse. Next was the hardware store. I bought a hammer, nails, a heavy-duty tarp, work gloves, and a new padlock for the shed. The man behind the counter was old and leathery, with hands as tough as tree bark. He sized me up with a shrewd gaze. "You the one staying out at the old Rose place?" he asked. News traveled fast in a small town. "Just got here," I said, not offering any more information. He grunted. "Place needs a lot of work. Rose was a good woman. Kept to herself, though, especially near the end." His words were a small confirmation, another piece of the puzzle falling into place. My last stop was the bank. It was the most intimidating building on the street, all brick and polished brass. I felt like a fraud walking in, my dirty clothes and worn-out backpack a stark contrast to the quiet, orderly atmosphere. I walked up to a teller, a young woman who looked barely older than me. My heart was pounding. This was the moment of truth. If the key didn't work, if the box wasn't there. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice professionally cheerful. "I need to access a safe deposit box," I said, my voice coming out as a squeak. I cleared my throat. "I have the key." I slid the small, cold key across the counter. She picked it up, examined the number stamped on it, and typed it into her computer. She frowned. "This box is registered to a Rose Alastair, and there's a note here. Access is restricted." My stomach plummeted. Of course, it was another dead end, a final, cruel joke. Restricted to whom? I asked, my voice tight. She looked back at her screen. Access is restricted to her grandson, Leo Alastair, on or after his 18th birthday. Can I see some ID, please? Relief washed over me in a dizzying wave. She had thought of everything. She had laid out a path for me, and all I had to do was walk it. I fumbled for my wallet, pulling out the state-issued ID card they had given me at the group home. My hands were shaking as I handed it to her. She checked the name, checked the birth date, and then gave me a bright, genuine smile. "Happy belated birthday, Leo. Right this way." She led me through a heavy steel door and into a vault lined with a honeycomb of small metal boxes. The air was cool and still, smelling of paper and metal. She used her key, then mine, and pulled out a long, thin metal box. She gestured to a small, private viewing room. "Take as much time as you need," she said, before leaving me alone and closing the door behind her. I sat down at the small table, my hands trembling as I lifted the lid of the box. Inside, there was only one document, a thick, official-looking piece of paper with seals and signatures. It was the deed to the farm. 120 acres of land, the house, the barn, all of it. And there, at the bottom, was the transfer of ownership, signed and notarized, effective on my 18th birthday. My name was printed in clear, bold letters. Leo Alastair, owner. It was real. I stared at my name on that paper for a long time. For my entire life, I had been a ward of the state, a case number, a temporary resident. I had never owned anything, not really. Now, I owned a piece of the world. A broken, neglected piece of the world, but it was mine. Tucked inside the folded deed was another, smaller envelope. This one wasn't sealed. I pulled out a single sheet of paper. It was another note from her. "Leo, if you're reading this, you have the deed. The land is yours. But owning it and keeping it are two different things. You need help. There is a lawyer in town named Arthur Arris. He was a friend of your grandfather's. He's old and grumpy, but he is the most honest man I have ever known. He knows some of the story, but not all of it. Show him this note. He will help you file the deed correctly and make sure everything is legally sound. Do not trust anyone else. Be careful. The world is full of men like Marcus Thorne. Stay safe, my lion. Rose." A lawyer, Mr. Arris. She had left me a map and a guardian angel. I carefully placed the deed and the note back in the box, returned it to the teller, and walked out of the bank into the bright afternoon sun, blinking like a creature emerging from a long hibernation. The world felt different, sharper. I had a purpose, a plan. I found the law office of Arthur Arris in a small building wedged between the diner and a closed-down movie theater. The paint was peeling, and the name on the glass was faded, but it felt solid, reliable. I pushed the door open, a small bell tinkling overhead. The office was cluttered with books and stacks of paper, smelling of old leather and coffee. A man who could only be Arthur Arris sat behind a massive wooden desk. He was exactly as she'd described, old, with a fringe of white hair, a face like a crumpled road map, and a deeply skeptical expression. He looked up at me over a pair of reading glasses perched on the end of his nose. "What do you want?" he grumbled, his voice like gravel being stirred with a stick. I took a deep breath. "My name is Leo Alastair. My grandmother, Rose, told me to find you." His eyes narrowed. He leaned back in his chair, the leather creaking in protest. "Rose Alastair has been dead for almost a year, son. What kind of game are you playing?" "It's not a game," I said, my voice steadier than I expected. I walked to his desk and placed the note from the safe deposit box in front of him. He picked it up gingerly, as if it might bite him. He read it, his expression unreadable. Then he read it again. He slowly took off his glasses and rubbed his eyes, a long, weary sigh escaping his lips. "Rose," he whispered to himself, "you stubborn, brilliant woman." He looked at me then, truly looked at me, and his gaze had softened. The skepticism was gone, replaced by a deep, world-weary sadness. She really did it. She saved the farm. He gestured to the worn chair opposite his desk. "Sit down, son. It seems you and I have a great deal to talk about." For the next 2 hours, I told him everything. I told him about the group home, aging out, arriving at the farm. I told him about the dogs, the shed, the footlocker, the money, and the first letter. I left nothing out. He listened patiently, his hands steepled under his chin, not interrupting once. When I was finished, a heavy silence filled the room. "Marcus Thorne," Aris finally said, the name tasting like poison in his mouth. "I haven't heard that name in years. I always wondered what happened. Rose just vanished. The foreclosure notices started, then the property just sat there, tangled up in county red tape. I tried to look into it, but I hit a brick wall at every turn. It was a legal masterpiece of obfuscation. She built a ghost ship and sailed it right under his nose." He shook his head in disbelief and admiration. "She was protecting you." "I know," I said quietly. "What happens now?" "Now," he said, leaning forward with a newfound energy, "we fight back. First thing tomorrow, we are going to the county clerk's office. We will file this deed. We will pay any outstanding fees with the cash you found. We will make your ownership ironclad, public, and undeniable. Thorne's old claim is long expired. Legally, he has no footing. But men like him don't always play by the legal rules." A chill went down my spine. "You think he'll come back?" "I think," Aris said, his eyes hard, "that a man who wants 120 acres of prime development land is going to notice when it's suddenly registered to an 18-year-old kid who appeared out of nowhere. We need to be prepared. We need to move fast." He stood up and walked to a filing cabinet, pulling out a thick, dusty file labeled Alastair. "Your grandmother and I started preparing for this day a long time ago. She paid me a retainer, years back, to help you if you ever showed up. Looks like the time has come to earn it." He turned to me, a grim but determined smile on his face. "Welcome home, Leo. Now let's get to work." Walking back to the farm as the sun began to set, the grocery bags and hardware supplies heavy in my arms, I felt a strange mixture of terror and exhilaration. The fight wasn't over. It had just begun. But for the first time in my life, I wasn't fighting alone. As I came up the driveway, Ranger and Bear started barking, a joyous, welcoming sound. They ran to meet me, their tails wagging furiously. I dropped the bags and knelt, burying my face in their thick fur. They were my family now. That night, I didn't sleep in the shed. I dragged a mattress from one of the sheet-covered beds downstairs into the living room, near the big stone fireplace. I swept a clear space on the floor, laid out my sleeping bag, and built a small, careful fire. The flames pushed back the damp and the dark, filling the room with a warm, flickering light. Ranger and Bear lay on either side of me, two furry guardians. As I drifted off to sleep, listening to the crackle of the fire and the soft sounds of their breathing, I felt a sense of peace I had never known. It wasn't the end of the story. It was the end of the beginning. The next morning, I was at Arthur Arris's office before he'd even finished his first cup of coffee. He greeted me with a nod and a pile of paperwork. We spent the morning going over the deed, the trust documents Rose had established, and the long, convoluted history of the property taxes. It was like learning a new language, the language of ownership, of liens and titles and easements. Arthur was a patient teacher, explaining every detail until he was sure I understood. He wanted me to be a participant in my own rescue, not a passenger. "Knowledge is armor, Leo," he said, tapping a thick legal textbook. "Especially when you're up against a dragon." At the county courthouse, a grand, imposing building that smelled of floor wax and bureaucracy, I felt small and out of place. But with Arthur at my side, I felt a confidence I couldn't have mustered on my own. He moved through the clerk's office with the practiced ease of a man who knew the system, who knew its rules and its loopholes. He filed the deed. He presented the proof of paid taxes. He had me sign my name on a dozen different forms, my hand surprisingly steady. With each signature, I felt like I was forging a new identity, one signature at a time. The clerk, a woman who looked permanently bored, stamped the final document with a loud, satisfying thud. "It's done," Arthur said, a rare smile touching his lips. "As of this moment, you are the undisputed owner of the Allister farm. Congratulations, son." We walked out into the sunlight, and for the first time, the future didn't feel like a terrifying, formless void. It felt like a piece of land, my land. But Arthur's words from the day before echoed in my mind. "What about Thorne?" I asked. "He'll find out," Arthur said, his expression turning serious again. "A property transfer like this is public record. His people will be monitoring it. He'll know within a week, maybe less. We need to expect a visit." The thought sent a jolt of fear through me. What will he do? "He'll start with an offer," Arthur predicted. "A generous one. He'll try to buy you out, assuming you're just some kid who got lucky and doesn't understand what he has. He'll have his own lawyers send you intimidating letters, talking about contesting the title, claiming old debts. It'll be a bluff, all of it. A storm of paper to scare you into selling. And if I don't sell? Then he might get less conventional," Arthur said, his voice low. "That's what worries me. That's the man your grandmother was afraid of." The plan was simple. Get the farm into a defensible state. That meant fixing things, making it look lived in, occupied, and protected. It also meant not being a hermit. "You need to be seen in town, Leo," Arthur advised. "Let people know you're here to stay. A community is its own kind of security system. Men like Thorne prefer to operate in the shadows, against isolated targets." The following days were a blur of hard, physical labor. I started with the house. Using the money from the footlocker, I hired a local handyman, a quiet man named Sal that Arthur recommended, to help me patch the worst part of the roof with the tarp I'd bought. Sal didn't ask many questions. He just showed up, did the work, and accepted his pay with a grateful nod. His presence was a small but significant step toward rejoining the world. I spent hours pulling down rotten drywall, clearing out debris, and scrubbing away a decade of grime. Every muscle in my body ached, but it was a good ache. It was the pain of creation, of reclamation. While I worked, Ranger and Bear were my constant companions. They followed me from room to room, their presence a steady comfort. They were a living link to my grandmother, a reminder of her love and foresight. I learned their routines, the way Ranger would sit perched on the porch, his ears twitching, scanning the tree line, while Bear preferred to nap in a patch of sun on the living room floor. One afternoon, while clearing out a rotted section of floorboards in the kitchen, my crowbar hit something solid. It wasn't a joist. Curious, I pried up the surrounding boards and found a small, metal-lined hollow carved out of the foundation. Inside was a small, locked wooden box. My heart hammered in my chest. Another secret. I carried it out to the shed, where I kept my tools, and carefully pried the small lock open. It wasn't filled with money or documents. It was filled with photographs, letters, and small trinkets. It was a treasure chest of memories. There were photos of my grandmother as a young woman, her smile bright and hopeful. Photos of my grandfather, a kind-faced man with laugh lines around his eyes. And photos of me, as a baby, a toddler, a little boy with a gap-toothed grin, sitting on my grandfather's lap or helping my grandmother in the garden. Underneath the photos were letters, not from my grandmother to me, but letters between her and my grandfather when he was away for work. They were love letters, full of inside jokes, shared dreams for the farm, and endless affection. They were building a life here, a life they intended to fill with love and family. They were building it for me. I sat on the floor of the dusty kitchen, surrounded by the ghosts of my family's happiness, and I didn't cry. I smiled. She hadn't just left me a piece of land and some money. She had left me my history. She had given me back the family I thought I'd lost forever. A week after filing the deed, it happened. A sleek black car, the kind that looks completely alien on a gravel country road, pulled up my driveway. Ranger was on his feet instantly, a low growl rumbling in his chest. Bear stood beside him, a silent, imposing wall of fur. I had been expecting this, thanks to Arthur, but my stomach still twisted into a knot. A man in an expensive suit got out of the car. He was tall, with slicked-back hair and a smile that didn't reach his cold, calculating eyes. "Leo Alistair?" he called out, his voice smooth and polished. I walked out onto the porch, the dogs flanking me. "I am," I said, my voice coming out stronger than I felt. "My name is Mr. Davison," he said, extending a business card. "I represent a real estate investment group that has a long-standing interest in this property. I'm here to make you a very generous offer." It was just as Arthur had predicted. "I'm not selling," I said, my voice flat. Davison's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. "Perhaps you haven't had a chance to consider the realities of your situation, Mr. Alistair. This property is in significant disrepair. The cost of making it habitable would be astronomical. We are prepared to offer you $750,000, enough to start a new life anywhere you want. College, a business, a nice apartment in the city. A clean break." The number hung in the air, glittering and seductive. It was more money than I could even comprehend. It was an escape hatch from all this work, all this struggle. For a fleeting moment, I was tempted. I could take that money and disappear. But then I looked at the house, my house. I thought of the letters, the photographs, the sacrifice my grandmother had made. I thought of her final words. "This land is our family's heart." Some things weren't for sale. "The answer is no," I said again, more firmly this time. "The farm is not for sale." Davison's mask of civility slipped. His eyes hardened. "I think you're making a mistake, kid. A big one. My employer, Mr. Thorne, doesn't like to be told no. There are complications with a title to this land, old debts that haven't been settled. It could get very messy, very expensive for you in court. The bluff, right on schedule. I have a lawyer, I said, channeling Arthur's grumpy confidence. Any further communication can go through him. His name is Arthur Eris. The mention of Arthur's name seemed to surprise him. He knew the name. It meant something. Now, I said, taking a step forward, you're on private property. I'd like you to leave. Ranger punctuated my statement with a deep, menacing growl. For the first time, Mr. Davison looked genuinely unnerved. He gave the dogs a wide berth as he backed away to his car. "You'll be hearing from us," he said, the words a clear threat. He got in the car, and it sped down the driveway, leaving a cloud of dust in its wake. I stood on the porch for a long time after he was gone, my heart pounding with a mixture of fear and triumph. I had faced the dragon's messenger, and I hadn't flinched. The first battle was over. But I knew the war was just beginning. Life on the farm settled into a new rhythm, an uneasy peace, punctuated by the constant low-grade hum of anxiety. Every time a car slowed on the main road, my head would snap up. Every unfamiliar sound in the woods sent a jolt of adrenaline through me. The threat from Thorn was no longer an abstract concept from a letter. It had a face now, a sleek black car, and a voice that dripped with veiled menace. True to Arthur's prediction, the official-looking letters started arriving a few days later. They were from a high-powered law firm in the city, filled with legal jargon about contested titles, outstanding liens from my grandfather's era, and claims of encroachment from neighboring properties that didn't exist. It was a paper blizzard designed to intimidate and overwhelm. The first letter made my blood run cold. The second made me angry. By the third, I just took them straight to Arthur. He would read them, snort with derision, and toss them onto a growing pile on his desk. "Standard intimidation tactics, Leo," he'd say, peering at me over his glasses. "They're trying to bleed you dry with the threat of legal fees. They expect you to panic and fold. Don't." His calmness was an anchor. He'd draft a terse, dismissive response to each letter, a legal shield I could never have constructed on my own. But the fight wasn't just happening in the mail. It was happening on the land itself. I threw myself into the work with a feverish intensity. Rebuilding the farm became an act of defiance. Every nail I hammered was a statement. Every weed I pulled was a reclamation. Sal, the handyman, became a regular presence. We shored up the sagging porch, replaced the broken windows, and began the monumental task of clearing the caved-in section of the barn. He was a man of few words, but his steady competence was a comfort. He taught me how to use tools I'd never held before, how to measure twice and cut once, how to read the language of wood and stone. One day, as we were hauling rotten timbers out of the barn, he paused and looked at me. "You're doing good work here, kid," he said. "Your grandma would be proud." Coming from a man who rarely spoke more than 3 words at a time, it felt like the highest praise. I was also making a conscious effort to follow Arthur's advice and become part of the town. I made a point to buy my groceries from the local store, my hardware from the old man who ran the shop, and to get coffee at the diner every few days. At first, people were wary. I was the ghost from the Alastair place, a mystery. But slowly, tentatively, things began to change. The cashier at the grocery store, Sarah, started asking about the dogs. The hardware store owner, Mr. Henderson, started giving me unsolicited advice on fence posts. The waitress at the diner, a woman named Maria, started saving me a corner booth, and knew my coffee order by heart. They were small connections, fragile threads, but they were weaving me into the fabric of the community. They were making me a neighbor, not just an occupant. One evening, the sheriff's car pulled into my driveway. My heart leaped into my throat. The sheriff was a big man with a calm demeanor. His name was Chief Brody. He got out of his car slowly, his hands in plain sight. "Evening, Leo," he said, giving Ranger and Bear a respectful nod. "Just making the rounds. Arthur Aris mentioned you were getting some unwanted attention." "You could call it that," I said, my relief palpable. "Well, I just wanted you to know that we're keeping an eye on things. This is a quiet town. We like to keep it that way. If you see that black car around again, or anyone else who doesn't belong, you give me a call, day or night." He handed me his card. It was another layer of protection, another wall in the fortress I was building around my home. He was telling me I wasn't alone. The community was watching too. The real turning point came a few weeks later. I was in town picking up supplies when I saw the black car parked outside the diner. My stomach clenched. Through the window, I could see Davison, the lawyer, sitting in a booth with a man I didn't recognize. This man was older, with an air of cold, predatory authority. He was impeccably dressed, but there was a hardness in his eyes that the expensive suit couldn't conceal. It had to be him. Marcus Thorne. I felt a primal urge to run, to get back to the safety of the farm. But then I thought of my grandmother, of Arthur, of the promise I'd made to myself. I took a deep breath, straightened my shoulders, and walked into the diner. The bell over the door tinkled, and every head turned. Thorne's eyes locked onto mine. There was a flicker of surprise, then a cold, amused smile spread across his face. He had expected me to hide, to be afraid. He hadn't expected me to walk into his den. I ignored him. I walked to the counter where Maria was working. "Just a coffee to go, Maria," I said, my voice steady. She glanced over at Thorne's table, her expression tightening. She understood what was happening. She poured the coffee with deliberate slowness, her presence a silent statement of solidarity. As I paid, Thorne's voice cut through the quiet murmur of the diner. "Mr. Allister, what a coincidence. Please, join us." It was a command, not an invitation. Every eye in the diner was on me. This was a test. I picked up my coffee, turned, and walked toward their table. I didn't sit. I stood there, looking down at him. "I have nothing to say to you, Mr. Thorne," I said. His smile widened. "Oh, I think we have plenty to talk about. Your grandmother, for instance. A stubborn woman. She cost me a great deal of time and money. I'm hoping her grandson has a better head for business." "My grandmother taught me the value of things that can't be bought," I replied, my voice cold. His amusement faded, replaced by a flash of irritation. "This is a waste of my time. I'll make you one final offer. $1 million. Take it, or I will bury you in legal fees and code violations until this farm is nothing but a liability you'll be begging me to take off your hands. I will own that land, boy, one way or another." The threat was naked now, stripped of all pretense. The entire diner had gone silent, listening. And in that moment, I felt the collective support of the room. I felt Mr. Henderson's glower from his booth, Maria's hand resting on the phone behind the counter, the curious but not unfriendly eyes of the other patrons. I wasn't just a kid he was trying to bully, I was one of them. "This conversation is over," I said. I looked him directly in the eye. "You will never own my family's farm. Not now, not ever. Stay away from my home." I turned my back on him and walked out of the diner, the bell tinkling behind me. I didn't look back. I got in my truck, an old beat-up pickup I'd bought from Sal for a few $100s, and drove away, my hands shaking but my heart resolute. I had faced the dragon himself, and I was still standing. The confrontation in the diner was a declaration of war, but it also changed something fundamental. The threat was now out in the open. Thorne had shown his hand in a public place, and the town had seen it. The next day, Sal showed up with his 2 grown sons to help me finish clearing the barn, refusing any payment. Mr. Henderson dropped off a box of new, heavy-duty locks for my doors and windows, on the house. The community was closing ranks around me. The legal letters from Thorne's lawyers stopped. Arthur suspected he was changing tactics, moving from intimidation to something more direct. We installed motion-activated security cameras around the property, simple ones that fed to a monitor in my kitchen. We were prepared, but the waiting was its own kind of torture. The break came from an unexpected source. Arthur, on a hunch, had been digging into Thorne's other development deals. He spent weeks poring over public records, land deeds, and corporate filings. One night, my phone rang late. It was Arthur, his voice buzzing with an excitement I'd never heard before. "I've got him, Leo," he said. "The man is a house of cards. He's leveraged to the hilt. He's been using fraudulent environmental reports to get his building permits approved on other projects. He's been bribing zoning officials. It's all here, a pattern of corruption going back years. Your farm isn't just another deal for him. He needs it. His investors are getting nervous, and he needs a big, successful project to calm them down. He's desperate." Arthur had found the dragon's weak spot. We had leverage, real leverage. The next morning, instead of waiting for Thorne's next move, we made ours. Arthur sent a single, simple letter to Thorne's legal team. It didn't mention the farm. It just listed the docket numbers of 3 other development projects Thorne was involved in, along with the name of an investigative reporter at a major city newspaper whom Arthur happened to know. The message was clear: back off, or we will burn your whole kingdom to the ground. We were offering him a choice: my small 100-acre farm or his entire multi-million-dollar empire. The silence that followed was deafening. A day went by, then 2. On the 3rd day, a courier delivered a document to Arthur's office. It was a legally binding agreement, drafted by Thorne's lawyers. In it, Marcus Thorne and all his associated companies relinquished any and all past, present, and future claims to the Alastair property. In exchange, we would agree to permanent silence regarding his other business affairs. Arthur read it over 3 times. He folded, he said, a slow grin spreading across his face. He folded completely. "It's over, Leo. You won." I sat in his office, the news washing over me. The weight that I had been carrying for months, the constant fear, the anxiety, it all just dissolved. I felt light, almost dizzy with relief. I had done it. My grandmother had given me the tools. Arthur had given me the guidance. The community had given me the support. But I had been the one to stand my ground. I had fought for my home, and I had won. The seasons turned. The tense, anxious autumn gave way to a quiet, peaceful winter. The first snow fell, blanketing the farm in a thick layer of white, muffling the world in a profound silence. It was a different kind of quiet than the one that had greeted me on my first day. This was a gentle, restorative silence, the sound of the land at rest. The victory against Thorne wasn't a loud, triumphant explosion. It was a slow, deep exhalation. The constant threat was gone, and in its absence, I could finally begin to truly heal and to build. The work on the farm continued, but the pace changed. It was no longer a frantic, defensive effort. It was a slow, deliberate act of love. I repaired the fence line my grandfather had built, my hands tracing the same wood his had. I planted a small winter garden, the green shoots pushing through the cold soil, a stubborn promise of life. I spent my evenings by the fire, reading the books from my old childhood bedroom, with Ranger and Bear sleeping at my feet. The house slowly transformed from a derelict shell into a home. It wasn't perfect. The floors still creaked, the walls were still drafty, but it was warm, it was safe, and it was mine. Every repaired window, every patched wall was a testament to my own resilience. I was rebuilding the house, and in doing so, I was rebuilding myself. I had come to this place a lost kid with nothing but a backpack and a ghost of a memory. I was a product of the system, defined by what I had lost. But the farm had changed me. It had given me more than just a roof over my head. It had given me a connection to my past, a purpose in my present, and a stake in my future. I learned that inheritance isn't just about money or property. It's about the stories that are passed down, the sacrifices that are made, the love that endures even after death. My grandmother had left me a legacy of strength and defiance, and I was now its steward. I wasn't just Leo, the kid who aged out. I was Leo Alistair, the guardian of my family's heart. My relationship with the town deepened. I was no longer a curiosity. I was a fixture. I joined the volunteer crew that helped clear the roads after a big snowstorm. I helped Sal fix the roof on the town's small community hall. I shared the vegetables from my garden with my neighbors. I was putting down roots, not just on my farm, but in the community that had quietly, steadfastly stood with me. One day in early spring, as the last of the snow was melting and the first buds were appearing on the trees, Arthur Arris drove up to the farm. He got out of his car and looked around, a rare, genuine smile on his face. The porch was straight, the windows were glazed, and a thin tendril of smoke curled from the chimney. "Looks like a home, Leo," he said. "It feels like one," I replied. We sat on the porch steps, drinking coffee, watching Ranger and Bear chase squirrels in the yard. "Your grandmother would be so proud of you," he said quietly. "More than you know." I thought about her letter, about her words. Be happy. You deserve to be happy. I looked out over the rolling fields of my farm, the land that held the stories of my family, the land I had fought for. I felt the solid wood of the porch beneath me, the warmth of the sun on my face, the steady, comforting presence of my dogs. And I realized, with a sense of profound, quiet certainty, that I was happy. My journey had started in homelessness and despair, on a lonely road leading to a ruin. But it had brought me here. It had brought me home. This story, my story, is about finding a home in the most unexpected of places. It's about realizing that family is more than just the people who are with us. It's also in the memories they leave behind, the sacrifices they make for us, and the love that guides us even when they're gone. It's about choosing to fight for something, even when you're scared, even when you feel alone. Because sometimes, the things that are most broken are the things most worth saving. And that includes ourselves. I share this with you because I know I'm not the only one who has had to fight for their place in the world. I'm not the only one who has felt lost, only to find their way back through an act of love from someone in their past. What has this story taught you about the meaning of home? What have you inherited from your family that isn't about money, but about strength, or resilience, or love? I really want to know. Share your story in the comments below. I'll be reading them, because every story shared is a light in the dark for someone else. And if this meant something to you, if you believe in the power of stories like this to connect us, then please subscribe and become part of this community. We're all just trying to find our way home, and maybe, by sharing our maps, we can help each other get there.